Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and by other public television stations.
We're in Manila, standing in front of a historic building. It is the palace that was occupied by the Spanish viceroys, subsequently by the governors general representing the United States, including William Howard Taft and Douglas MacArthur. During the war, a Philippine president occupied it, subject to the Japanese administration. It is now the home of the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, with whom we'll spend the next hour. Ferdinand Edralin Marcos is the president of the Philippines, elected to that office in 1965, re-elected in 1969, and, so to speak, institutionalized in power by a series of military, political, and juridical acts that followed the promulgation of martial law on September 22nd, 1972. Although in recent weeks President Marcos has said that there will be free elections or a referendum perhaps a year from now, there is no surviving constitutional mechanism that requires him to call them. The existing situation, his phrase, is called constitutional authoritarianism. Ferdinand Marcos was born in 1917, and by the time the Japanese invaded the Philippines after Pearl Harbor, he had acquired a reputation as a brilliant young lawyer, first in his class at the university, fluent in several languages. During the occupation, he distinguished himself by successive acts of ingenuity and heroism that brought him more decorations than any other Filipino, including 2 Silver Stars from the U.S. Army and a recommendation for the Congressional Medal of Honor. He survived the Bataan Death March, escaped a Japanese death camp, helped organize the resistance, and ended the war as a colonel in the Philippine Army. He turned to politics and was elected to the House of Representatives and subsequently to the Senate. In 1954, he married his famous wife, the former Imelda Romualdez, who is now governor of Greater Manila, and in the description of Foreign Secretary Carlos Romulo, de facto vice president of the Philippines. He acceded to the presidency when he defeated the incumbent, Diosdado Macapagal, by a heavy margin. In his foreign policy, President Marcos has recently sought to stress the Asiatic connection of the Philippines, resulting, some say, in a detachment from the traditional closeness with the United States, the strategic consequences of which are imponderable, which leads me to suggest that we should ponder them. I should like to begin by asking President Marcos whether it is his opinion that the failure of the United States to secure the independence of South Vietnam is largely responsible for the readjustment of your foreign policy.
No. Excuse me. Actually, the foreign policy of the Philippines is dictated by many factors, one of which is the fact that the Philippines has been identified before the war as a colony of the United States. It passed through a Commonwealth period. And having gone through 400 years of Spanish subjugation and conquest, and another 50 years of American occupation, the Philippines had somehow lost its original and indigenous culture. it became necessary for the Philippines, therefore, in order to reestablish its identity, and for the Filipino, especially the Filipino who was educated in Western ways, to retrace his roots. And retracing his roots, of course, discovered that he was Asian. More than anything else, the alluvium of Western culture was there. And so the Philippines became some kind of a melting pot of many cultures and many races. These varied inflows of not only cultures but also influences established the basis for much of what the Philippines is doing now.
Well, is there any sense in which the apparent retreat of the United States after the fiasco in Vietnam catalyzed what you are speaking about? Is there any sense in which it served as a cultural reminder that your natural affiliations lay to the West rather than to the East?
Well, yes and no. Security is another thing. The withdrawal of the United States from not only Vietnam, but also Thailand. And now the withdrawal of ground troops in Korea, plus the repeated announcements to the effect that the United States might be compelled to withdraw from the Pacific, of course, required a reassessment of the position of small countries like the Philippines. Remember, the United States has a Mutual Defense Pact, a Military Assistance Pact, and a Military Bases Agreement with the Philippines. These agreements, of course, have been the basis for much of the security decisions made by the Philippines in the past several decades. If the United States, as had been announced by some responsible quarters, was reviewing these agreements with its allies, not only here in the Philippines, but also elsewhere in the world, then it was necessary for us to review our agreements.
Well, now, you mentioned to a journalist early this year that to a considerable extent, your future policies would depend on whether President Carter was prepared to guarantee the security of your homeland. You didn't go further than to say just that, but a lot of Americans have been curious as to the exact meaning of what you intended to say there.
No, actually what I meant was, would the United States comply with its obligation under the Mutual Defense Pact in case we were attacked? Mm-hmm. And I do not refer to any specific country. Of course, these are theoretical situations which every leader must prepare for. And I realized, first of all, that there was a conflict between the authority and power of the President and your Congress and the American Congress. And that the American people, too, had felt there was a need to constrict your lines, as it were, and lessen your role as a policeman throughout the world. This, of course, raised the possibility that the United States, in reviewing its military agreements, might be more interested in say, giving countries like the Philippines an opportunity at self-reliance. and increasing its capability to defend itself instead of depending on the United States.
The Guam Doctrine, in effect.
I have always felt that this doctrine did not start with Guam, but that's another matter.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. President. Would it affect your reasoning or your projections if the United States were to abrogate its defense treaty with Taiwan?
It probably would.
That is to say, if we were to do that, it would be one more suggestion to you that what you speak of as this constraint of American power was going one further step, and that perhaps the next day, tomorrow, or day after tomorrow, it would be the turn of the Philippines.
No, this would be a reflection of some modifications of the basic policy in the Western Pacific. Although I believe the American political leadership has repeatedly stated that it needed, to maintain its presence in the Western Pacific. I cannot speak for the United States. I don't know what presence means. The American Congress and the presidency of the United States would have to define what that presence is. However, we should be ready for any contingency. And as you have said, the withdrawal from Taiwan would be another manifestation of a lessening presence of the United States. And there must be a corresponding effort on the part of small countries like the Philippines to fill up any gap, any hiatus that would result.
I'm aware that you are engaged even as we speak in negotiations involving Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base. Were you disturbed by the two reports by American agencies recommending the discontinuation of those facilities?
I am not aware of any official recommendation to this effect, but I did read some reports of some individual officers.
Yes.
Who felt that these bases in the Philippines are no longer necessary. We ourselves have prepared for the eventuality that the United States would withdraw from such bases. If the United States does, then we would have to take over. But as I have said, the negotiations on the military bases are premised on the statement of the United States that excuse me, they need those bases, not only for the protection of, say, the metropolitan area of the Philippines under the Mutual Defense Pact, but as a part of a defense scheme for the entire region of Southeast Asia and of the world. Now, if this is true, and I believe it is, then the military bases and their continuation would be a part of our contribution to world peace and the peace of the region.
You were quoted in a story in Time magazine a few months ago as follows. It was a rather arresting quotation. Time magazine wrote, "The contemporary world figure admired most by both Marcos and Imelda is China's Chairman Mao Zedong. Reason, Mao, as the president puts it, united, quotes, 800 million volatile and historically disparate and separated people." I remember it was almost 10 years ago that Marshal Key was quoted as saying that the figure he admired most was Adolf Hitler. He intended by that a very narrow construction. Many Americans are curious whether your alleged admiration for Mao Zedong is an admiration in any sense of his philosophy, of his techniques for staying in power, or is it purely a narrow construction of what he accomplished that commends him to you?
The latter. Actually, China will always be a concern of any small country close to the mainland. And every leader in Southeast Asia studies what happens in China. We all know that China will be the center of almost everything within a decade or two. Right now, it's consolidating. And a leader does disservice to his people if he does not know what's happening in China. Almost everybody admires Chairman Mao Zedong for the accomplishment of what many Chinese leaders have failed at. This is the unification of the Chinese people. A people divided, isolated, degraded, colonized, a people that was marked as a sleeping giant, even by Napoleon, but a people with potentialities. And this is, of course, as I said, an admiration that is limited to the mere achievement of unification of a people.
Well, Mr. President, I was 2 days ago with Premier Jiang Jingkuo. He maintains that he too, for the same reasons, is greatly concerned with what's happening on the mainland. And he believes there are more indices now of a disunification than there have been for years, as witness the instability of the question of the successor to Mao Zedong. He maintains, as do certain other observers, that the signs that China is unified are very superficial. Have you allowed yourself to meditate on that alternative?
Well, yes, actually, the first few decades of unification of any people would always be ticklish. China is no exception. They would have problems. And there are critical moments in any nation's life. I'm certain they've passed through many. They may pass through some more. I am not ready to judge exactly how correct the assessments of Premier Chiang Ching-kuo may be. But the way I look at it, when I visited China in 1975, the leadership seemed to be in the control.
Yes, but most of those leaders are now either executed or out of power.
No, well, the Gang of Four.
Oh, dead.
Yes, but Deng Xiaoping is still there.
That's right. This is his
actually
third resurrection.
Cannot say how deep the symptoms are that are referred to by Premier Chiang Ching-kuo. And I would rather not be a judge of it.
Of course. Well, let me ask you then let me ask you a philosophical question. In my country, we fought a very bloody war to prevent secession just over 100 years ago. And Abraham Lincoln, in a famous letter to a New York editor, said that he sought to preserve the Union above all things. Is it your judgment that any means are tolerable, including the repression used by Mao Zedong on such a vast scale to bring about the unification of a national abstraction?
Yes and no. I myself am of the belief that authority must be utilized by government to attain certain noble objectives, but that authority must be circumscribed. And
But Mao's never was.
What's this?
Mao Zedong's never was circumscribed.
Well, I seriously doubt if there was ever any effort to circumscribe his powers.
But you admire him just the same.
No, I admire the manner in which, notwithstanding the fact that the Chinese people have never been used to a single leadership, they accepted single leadership. Yes, he may have used, of course, repression. I concede that. However, as I have said, the fact is he united these people. One of the things that I have always maintained is that repression is not necessarily a means to unity. Repression can backfire. Repression can cause rebellion, revolution. Repression, say, amongst the people like the Filipinos, would result in immediate revolution.
Well, but isn't it true, Mr. President, that the 20th century has shown us that the techniques of repression are so refined that, for instance, a single dictator like Stalin could force a unity, however synthetic, among the disparate peoples that lie within the borders of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Japan, through the exercise of maximum repression, governed your country for 5 years, notwithstanding the heroism of such people as yourself.
Why? First of all, Stalin was not exactly too refined. And secondly,
yes,
the Japanese were not exactly...
Refine the techniques of repression.
Well, yes.
By refinement, I mean being prepared to kill 5 or 10 million people if necessary.
Well, he and some other leaders whom I know, but with respect to the Japanese, you remember that there was an underground here which immobilized about 200 to 300,000 of their men in the Philippines, which probably prevented the occupancy of Australia. And we flatter ourselves in believing that this was our contribution in the underground after our regular forces surrendered in Bataan and Corridor.
It was a very real contribution, like Tito's in Yugoslavia, who held down 250,000 Germans there. However, the question I'm asking you is, isn't it one of the great questions of the 20th century whether one is justified in using totalitarian means to effect a particular end, as Mao Zedong, whom you professedly admire, did in mainland China?
I wouldn't hold the paper for the use of repression to attain unity. But I would certainly maintain that this problem is not modern. It goes all the way back to 2,500 years ago. One of my favorite quotes is that of Heraclitus of Ephesus, who maintained that 2,500 years ago, in one of his writings, that precisely the question is to combine the exercise of, or the use of law with the individual rights of persons you rule, without which law individual rights would become anarchy, but to such an extent that the law does not become tyranny. And such a balancing between individual right and law will always be a question, not whether in the olden days or now. Presently, you have the problem of terrorism in the Western countries, West Germany, Italy, France, Holland, and I suppose in the United States. People are now asking, to what extent can government utilize authority in order to prevent terrorism? Terrorism is just another term for the individual or perhaps widespread utilization of violence and force to maintain what they claim is individual right. In many instances, however, in the developing countries, terrorism, anarchy is just another word for rebellion. And while in the Western world, apparently there is commendation for effective counteraction against terrorism. We in the smaller countries that have to confront the insurgency, which actually means daily terrorism, and must institutionalize and routinize effective counteraction by the use of authority, are condemned. This is, of course, something which puzzles many of us.
No, well, of course, I understand that. But the dilemma of Heraclitus was hardly discharged with success by Mao Zedong. The millions of people...
I don't refer to Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
Chairman Mao Zedong probably eliminated this dilemma with the statement, power comes out of the barrel of a gun.
Yes, but
Now, that's not exactly the kind of authority that I'm referring to.
No, but you see, when you brought up, when this is Manila time, right?
Yes?
When you brought up the problem of terrorists, I think you engaged the universal sympathy of mankind, but the kulaks, for instance, who were slaughtered by Stalin, or their equivalents in China, were hardly terrorists. The dissidents in the Soviet Union who are subjected to terror to the tyranny of the current regime are hardly terrorists. You have faced terrorists with the Hooks and now with the Moros, and I think there is universal sympathy with an attempt to control them. But, again I say, Americans are fascinated by the development of your mind. During the past few years, you were known as one of the stoutest defenders of democracy and civil rights in all of Asia. You face certain problems in the Philippines, and all of a sudden, before long, you were publicly saying that the man you admired most was Mao Zedong. And this, you can understand why this confuses a lot of Americans who began so sympathetically to you and your aims.
We adopt the proper perspective for this. I admire Mao Zedong for uniting a volatile, disparate, and historically separated people. Now, those words are exactly what I meant. I admire him for bringing them together, because no matter what anybody says, before, all these pogroms, these killings, this elimination of opposition, he attracted the peasantry to his cause. And perhaps later on in the maintenance of his power, he did commit all these excesses, which I do not condone. That is another matter.
Well, do you, in the course of cultivating friendly relations with the People's Republic of China and with the Soviet Union, do you modify in any particular your well-known historic positions that both of these powers are expansionary powers who seek to universalize their ideology and who in the past have helped terrorists in your own country?
First, the second premise about helping terrorists in our country, we have never accepted this as a fact. Yes, there were guns being brought in here from outside. We cannot prove that this came from communist China. I have the promise of the communist leaders that they won't help the communist movement here. I don't have any reason to distrust their word, because from the time in 1975, when I visited China, to the present, there is no evidence of any support for the communist movement coming from China. I am aware, of course, that the traditional position from arising out of the Cold War was to deny any basis for any rapprochement, any relations with the communist giants, the two communist giants. But not only detente, but also the realities of life. That this thing will pass and naturally we will have to maintain relations with the biggest nation in the world. We cannot ignore this. This is the reality of life. China is as big as life. You cannot close your eyes to it.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. President. Why should the Philippines be immune from intervention by the communist powers on the side of insurgencies? We know they're doing it all over Africa. We know they did it all over Latin America. We know that they are doing it right now in Thailand. We know that they conquered by such means they tried to conquer South Korea. They did conquer South Vietnam. What makes the Philippines sacred?
It's not sacred, but we are protected first by the China Sea. Secondly, it would not be profitable for them to come here. As far as I'm concerned, these are the two basic facts of life.
What sanctions do you exercise?
I beg your pardon?
What sanctions do you exercise that they are afraid of?
No, I don't think they're afraid of a small country like the Philippines, but it's not worth the trouble. It would cause, first of all, a rupture of our relations. And I don't believe that China considers that more advantageous. I mean, taking the Philippines more advantageous than, say, maintaining present mutual tolerance.
Well, then you do believe that they have renounced their ambitions for world revolution and a unified socialist world?
They maintain that they have not. I mean, the Communist Party. But I also maintain that the new leadership is pragmatic. Being pragmatic, it might moderate. I say might. I am not certain, I am not sure, nobody is. But by and large, these basic premises and assumptions seem to be accepted by the great majority of thinkers in this part of the world.
And do you think that pragmatism is something that developed in the last few years, as distinguished from those years during which you did not recognize the government of Peking?
No, Zhou Enlai was pragmatic. Deng Xiaoping was and is pragmatic. Deng Xiaoping is the symbol of continuity of the Zhou Enlai pragmatism.
Tradition.
And so I would say that the idea of perpetual revolution of Chairman Mao and his group of political ideologues were previously dominant, but that now perhaps they may not be that dominant anymore. That's what I'm saying.
That's it. Mr. President, when you decreed martial law in 1972, you gave as your reasons for doing so the decadence of what you call the old order. Could you describe for the benefit of Americans what it is that you found defective in the old order?
Well, the old order meant anarchy, disorder, rebellion. When I became president in 1965, I had warned that we were slowly slipping into an abyss from which there was no pulling out. And this was the gradual erosion of the authority of the government to enforce the law, to enforce existing law, not any new system of order, but the old system or the old codes of law, including the criminal code. Kidnapping was prevalent, so much so that the people never reported kidnapping anymore. The leftists were in collusion with the rightists. Whatever those two terms may mean. I myself don't believe in categorizing people, but there was a strange conspiracy between those whom many of our writers branded as leftists and those whom they branded as conservatives. Each one supporting the other for a purpose and resulting in the immobilization of our economy and the impotence of our government.
Why should that have been? Why should democracy not have worked in the Philippines?
It was partially the government's fault. First of all, you see, liberal democracy, as the United States knows it, was the result of a growth of how many centuries, how many years in your country. All of a sudden it's transplanted to Philippine soil. Have you ever attempted to transplant an apple from the United States to a tropical country like ours? Well, it just won't grow. The reason for this, it needs time to acclimatize. This is a tropical climate.
How much time?
Nobody knows. I don't. We tried to get used to it, and my predecessor somehow convinced you that we were democratic, but we all knew that this was some kind of a mask which we had put over our face. We were trying to ape you. And yet we didn't have the basic requirements: education, distribution of wealth, economic equality, equal opportunity, and the most important, belief in that. Many of our people, especially the rich, didn't believe in democracy. They believe in maintaining their privileges and obtaining favors from government. They had private armies. But the great number of people had been used to a prototype democracy. Because in the olden days, even before the arrival of the Spaniards in 1521, the chieftains, especially the war chiefs, were elected by the tribes. And so there was some kind of a prototype, the beginnings of a populist type of leadership. And so there was this discontent, valid grievance on the part of a great number of our people. But there was nothing that they could do. And the only alternative was violence. To bring about a radical restructuring and bring down, let us say, those who had imposed their leadership, taken over from the old Spanish grandees, and joined up with the Chinese-oriented merchants to control both politics and economy in the country, were for the maintenance of the status quo. And we all knew that we were sitting on top of a volcano, a social volcano. Nobody knew when it would erupt. And there was no way of aborting it. It was just a matter of time.
If we grant, if one grants that, if one grants that as an accurate historical analysis, and I know that a lot of people do grant it, the second question then is, in reestablishing order, has your regime done so by the use of a number of techniques which throughout your career you have criticized? For instance, torture, for instance, the denial of due process. Is this necessary to any rule by martial law?
There is no need to torture anyone, and we don't. It's not a policy. There may be exceptions, but these are all aberrations, and they don't mean complicity, conformity, or even conspiracy on the part of the political leadership. This we disavow, we condemn, we punish. We punish anyone, whether he be in the armed forces or a follower of the leadership. Anyone who utilizes his authority or power to enforce by violence, unacceptable violence, except by legitimate combat, any decisions of the government. But the important thing is, first of all, that while we sought to maintain order by dismantling the apparatus of the rebellion, we also sought to extirpate the causes of rebellion, the valid grievances that may exist, by economic, social, and even political reform. And this is the rub, as you would put it, because the legalists, of which there are many here in our country, there are a great number of lawyers here, do not believe in the use of martial law powers for radical reform. They believe that we, or I, should stick to the old classical concept of martial law, which means consolidate the status quo, maintain it as it is. It may have its deficiencies. It is not for martial law to correct it. It is for another institution to correct it. And I maintain that is not so. For if the purpose of martial law is to eliminate rebellion and maintain order, then one must eliminate the cause of rebellion. And the cause of rebellion may be economic and social inequality, injustice.
Well, what in the way of a reduction of that inequality has your regime accomplished?
You have given to every man the right of equal opportunity. Now, equal opportunity means greater liberty, greater freedom. For instance, the man who is held in bondage to the soil, he's not the equal of the man who has his own house, his own business source of income. By no means can anybody say that he is the equal. No, can anybody say that he has an equal opportunity? His children will never be going to school. Well, we have given him the chance to send his children to school, make them professionals, lawyers, doctors, whatever they may be able to attain. But we give them the opportunity now to develop their God-given and God-endowed faculties. And we also give them the opportunity to a decent and dignified type of a life. We give him land. But that's not all. Land reform as we practice it here is not just a mere doling out of land and turning men into beggars. We turn them into respectable and dignified and self-respecting men. We teach them how to use the land to produce income and produce decency, produce dignity.
I think a lot of people who have observed the Philippines during the past several years join in complimenting you on your land reform program. They do not feel that much has been accomplished, if anything, to help the urban poor.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. We have increased the minimum wage from 4 pesos to 13, 15 pesos, granting the erosion of the value of the peso, say even up to 50%. We have trebled and quadrupled the earnings of laborers. Now, how can that be so? At the same time, we have increased employment from 8% down to 4.5%. Those are the figures in unemployment. The enemy of the poor, which is inflation, from 44% down to 7%. Now, how can anybody deny all these facts?
Well, the specific charge is that in the last 3 years there has been a net reduction in the real income of the Filipino working in the cities.
That's pure stupidity.
It is.
Of course it is. It's ridiculous. They throw this around without any basis whatsoever. I can imagine people charging me with, say, fascism and the use of authority to perpetuate myself. That I will say may have a reason because I have proclaimed martial law. But there is no reason for anyone to say that the Filipino masses, including the urban poor, have not been given a decent life. We are increasing our expenses for socialized housing, socialized prices for the consumer goods. Our cost of living here is very much lower than any other country in the Southeast Asia, including our big neighbors. Now, at the same time, the more important thing is the Filipino, poor or not, now has pride in this country and has the equal opportunity to be anything. Be president if he can. Before you could not become anything else except perhaps remain as a janitor, a laborer, or a tenant. No, now you can aspire for almost anything.
Why didn't he have an opportunity before?
Because he was held back by those who were in power, including those who controlled the economic wealth of the country. We have increased the income of the lower classes of our people. We are creating a strong middle class. Before I became president, there was no such thing as a middle class. You were either very poor or very rich, no in between. Well, we are creating a middle class now, and a dignified middle class, not the middle class dependent on, say, favors from the government, but the middle class of small businessmen, professionals, and civil servants.
Well, in order to advance the program as you describe it, why is it necessary to deny to the press the freedom to criticize?
Of course, this is one of those allegations without basis. All we have done is, at the beginning of martial law, we imposed a ban on the publications, because the publications were used by the rebels, by the rebellion. Publications, all media for that matter, was controlled from September up to December of 1972. After that, we lifted everything. Anybody could write any story, and the publishers, television owners and networks and producers organized their own media council without the participation of government. Now, the Secretary of Public Information, originally a member of the media council, was asked to withdraw by me, and for that matter, the participation of anybody in government was terminated. And we left it to the owners of media, or those who were in media, publishers, producers, to organize themselves and to work out what they thought was necessary for media. To say that we are prohibiting any criticism is ridiculous. There's no such ban. In fact, we are criticized. I am criticized, and I accept it as a part of our growth. I grew up in the rough and tumble of politics and of trial law, and I am not that sensitive. I know, and I listen to criticism. If the criticism is well-based, I take action.
Well, what about the criticism of, using your figures, that there are 1,400 people in jail who have been there in some cases for 3 or 4 years, who have not been brought to trial?
No. There were 3,000 who were in jail. I released the 3,000. Then subsequent to this, um, the the incidents in crime increased. Correspondingly, there were increases in arrests, but not for political action, but for violation of the criminal code. As far as we are concerned, and I would like to maintain this, we have not jailed anyone for political beliefs or for political faith, especially the oppositionists. The oppositionists are still active here in the country. They have questioned my actuations openly. They've gone to court. Every act that I have taken, this referendum that I am calling for the presidency on December 17th, it's now before the Supreme Court. The opposition has raised it to our Supreme Court. If it were true that I am curtailing criticism here, then that would be the first thing to do, stop all of these actions in the Supreme Court, because that has become a harassment.
Well, are you saying, Mr. President, that there are not people in jail now who have not been tried, who are there?
Against whom there are no charges? No, I beg your pardon. Against whom there are no charges, formal charges. I have an order which is being complied with to the effect that no one should be arrested unless he commits a crime in the presence of the arresting officer or man, because we have civilian arrest here. Traditionally from time immemorial, unless there is two sworn statements about the commission of a crime. And immediately after arrest, he must go before an inquest officer and bring the accused, the arrested individual.
Well, under martial law, would it be a crime to challenge the legitimacy of your government?
No. They have gone and done it. They have challenged it. They have challenged it in elections or referenda conducted, elections for the Batasan Bayan. There is a statement to the effect that there are no elections in the Philippines. That's not quite true. We elected the members of the Legislative Council, and the contests about legitimacy of my government was an issue that was raised in the Supreme Court not just once, but repeatedly. They questioned the proclamation of martial law. They questioned the legitimacy of the entire government. They questioned the constitutionality of my actions, everything, even the expenditure of public funds. These have been raised to the Supreme Court.
Would you say that there is, in any sense, comparable the crisis of the Third Republic in France and the crisis of your antecedent government? That is to say, when de Gaulle came to power, he came in with a new constitution that allowed him to suspend the legislature.
Except that, yes, it is true, except that in my case, the Constitution already provided for martial law authority. Constitution, under the 1935 Constitution, under the 1935 decisions of the Constitutional Convention, provided, in case of invasion, insurrection, rebellion, or imminent danger thereof, and the public safety requires it, the President may suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus or proclaim martial law throughout the Philippines or any part thereof. This existed then, and I employed it. I had utilized first suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus after I used the armed forces. They were unavailing. And since they were inadequate to meet the crisis, I had to proclaim martial law. I asked Congress to do it, and they said, we don't have the power to proclaim martial law. I asked the courts to intervene, and the court said, we don't have the power. The power is in your hands. You assume the responsibility because you're president. So that was it.
Thank you very much, President Ferdinand Marcos of the
Thank you.
Philippines.
For a printed bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding was provided by this station and by other public television stations.